Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this final session of this program dedicated to Spain and Catalonia. I have to start with the bad news that Sebastian Balfour is not here with us today. Unfortunately, he's sick and he's excused himself early in the morning today. So that leaves us with the three remaining speakers, and I'm very pleased to welcome Manuel, Arias, Maldonado, Montserrat Guibernau, and Fernando Vallespín in this very stimulating debate about the question which is very much at the heart of the conflict between Spain and Catalonia. Is there a right to self-determination in the international context? Now, to start off, I would like to ask about this principle of self-determination. How is it applied nowadays? What examples are there in the international sphere of the principle of self-determination? So, would you like to start, Montserrat? Thank you.
All right. Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having invited me to this special event today at the CatLSE, so I'm very grateful for that. And I've just learned that we have to be very strict with the time, so I'll try not to give any pleasantries or anything else, but just go straight into the meat and then we can debate. The question is there a right to self-determination in the international context? The question is, does it make sense to speak about the right to self-determination in a representative democracy that respects the minorities? My response is, maybe not. However, within current Spain, and after years of constantly ignoring demands for dialogue on behalf of the legitimate representatives of a particular autonomous community, legally acknowledged and protected by the Spanish Constitution, the government of the state considers that it has the right to suspend all institutions while keeping dissenting politicians in prison under the auspices of Article 155. In addition, it threatens the Catalan education system, official in the autonomous community according to the Spanish Constitution. Maybe there is a right to self-determination of these people that, because of its status as a constant minority within the Spanish state, is always in danger while waiting for the decision of the dictator in charge. At present, it is debatable to argue that minorities are being fully respected, since Catalonia is not considered a separate demos within Spain, and any decision affecting its political status has to be sanctioned by all Spanish citizens, including the Catalans. The Catalans, they are a constant minority. Since the Catalans are a minority within Spain, it follows that they have little or no chance of ever having their voice heard, unless new policies destined to grant voice and veto power to minorities are put in place. This is my response to question 1.
Right. Fernando, would you like... you're actually running ahead, focusing on... It's more question 2 than question 1. I was referring...
I've got two.
To start off with the international context. I mean, how is the principle of self-determination applied nowadays, and what examples are there in the international sphere, before we can go into the specific case of Spain? Fernando.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I would also like to thank the organizers for the invitation. I think now that the the two main actors in Spain don't dialogue among themselves. I think it's great that at least part of the civil society does it. I mean, I think it's very important that we discuss this this very difficult issue. Okay, I'll try to be very quick on the first question because I think it's an easy question to answer. Because if we look at the provisions in international law, there are two conflicting principles. On the one hand, we have the principle of self-determination of the peoples, but on the other hand, we have the principle of territorial integrity. So they are contradictory principles, but the way that they have been interpreted implies that the first principle applies mainly to colonial situations, whereas the second applies for ordinary cases. So I don't think the Catalan case can be thus justified under international law as a case of a right to self-determination of the peoples, because first we would have to try to find out what a people is, and if the Catalans are a people, or if a people can be easily substantiated as such, in such a complex situation as we have, not just in Spain or in Catalonia, but in other European regions. So, which of the two principles ought to prevail then? I think it's in this issue. I think it's crucial to see what happened in Canada, because the Clarity Act that was issued on part of the Canadian Supreme Court, after having been asked by the Canadian Parliament as to what to do with Quebec. So the question was very simple: does Quebec has a right to unilaterally anti-secession or put a secession into practice? And the response of the Supreme Court was very clear. Quebec could not secede unilaterally under Canadian or international law. However, and I think this proviso is quite important. However, what the Supreme Court states as well is that this is a very important political situation, not just a legal situation, but a political situation which implies that in the case that a large majority of the people of Quebec would be in favor of to secede, that the Canadian government had to enter into negotiations. And then it also provided the need to there being a sufficient majority. It has never been clarified what it means, but it certainly means much more than just one more vote in favor of either secession or it being within the Canadian state, which was not the case of Catalonia. The last the legal referendum. Participation didn't matter. And just with one more vote in favor of independence, that's it. But that would solve the problem. So I think if we look at the legal situation, which I think is what we are being asked now, and I hope we'll answer into the political issue, which is, I think, it's an important thing about this. If we look at the legal issue, I think the question has to do with internal law, and has to do with what the Constitution establishes. And the Spanish Constitution is like any other constitution in Europe except in the United Kingdom, for reasons that you perfectly know, states that the sovereignty lies on the Spanish people. So there are no such thing as a Catalan demos or Andalusian demos or a Basque demos. There's just one demos, which is the Spanish one. And so this provision has to be applied. And if this provision is broken, as was the case in Catalonia, then just as we have, because our Article 155 was copied almost literally from Article 32 of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, which is the German constitution, which states that in the case that a Land, in our case an autonomous community, breaks the law, then the central state has the right to impose certain sanctions or to take over the government. And that's simply what happened. But there are most of the situations, we also asked about it, of recent secessions or breakdown of former states happened through internal law. That was the case of the Soviet Union in 1990. That was the case of Czechoslovakia, which was a gentleman's agreement between the Czechs and the Slovaks. And then we have the case of Kosovo, which is I think this is the prototypical situation of when a right to secession applies, which is when certain injustice are being undertaken on part of the central state, in that case, in part of Serbia, right? So there was almost genocide being implemented of the Kosovan people, but I don't think that's the case of a self-governing body, as was Catalonia, and with a degree of autonomy that can only be matched by maybe Flanders and Wallonia and within Europe. So it's not that the Catalans cannot decide or cannot have a right to self-govern. They do have the right to self-government. What they don't have is the right to secede, which I think it's different. And I think with this we can enter to the following question.
Manuel, Arias.
Thanks very much. Good evening to everyone. I'm also very happy to be here inside you, discussing this fascinating subject. And I thank you very much the organizers for inviting me. I will try to give a theoretical answer under the understanding that what I will say, to my mind, is perfectly applicable to the case of Catalonia. In order to supplement what Fernando has said, I mostly agree with him. And to my mind, it's clear that there is not such thing as a right to self-determination in democratic and pluralistic societies. And these two conditions are very important here. We're talking about constitutional democracies, we are talking about pluralistic societies where there does not exist an overwhelming majority in favor of this succession. Of course, this does not prevent certain democracies from arranging referendums where succession is at stake. It has happened in Quebec, and it has happened in Scotland as well. Of course, many things can be decided upon in a democracy, and this is one of them, and this is not tantamount to the recognition of a right to self-determination, or to say that such right exists, unless in very particular cases that Fernando has described. And to me this is very important, the fact that it is not a frivolity, or it is not a whimsical conclusion, the fact that international law does not recognize the right to succeed or the right to self-determination, except in two very particular cases, which are those regarding colonial rule or oppression. And I don't think that any of them applies to Catalonia nowadays. So I think this is a somewhat underappreciated fact. This restriction of the right to self-determination in international law has a reason. And that is also why the majority of constitutions in liberal democracies do not include this right in their texts. So to me, succession is, in most cases, an anachronism, something that comes too late, so to speak, in the 21st century. And the normative reasons behind this restriction, I mean, we can cite many of them. Of course, one important reason is the undesirability of grounding the international order upon the so-called normative, nationalistic normative principle, according to which every self-appointed nation, this is an important point, self-appointed nation, so people who claim that they are the right authentic people representing a whole community, must have access to statehood. If this principle were applied, this so-called demonstration effect would be enforced, so that there would be an incentive in many communities all around the world for nationalists to pursue independence. And there is no way that viable international order can be grounded like in this way. On the other hand, we can also mention the incompatibility between identity arguments and democratic deliberation. I think this is a problem. It is not well discussed either. And of course, to me, probably the main reason why there is no such thing as a right to self-determination is the threat to social pluralism. In the case of Catalonia, for instance, we cannot say that the Catalans want to succeed. Who are the Catalans? Where is this overwhelming majority of Catalans wanting to succeed? These things does not exist. So saying the Catalans want to succeed is a misrepresentation of reality. And what I think is lacking often in this analysis, when we look at this subject, is a proper understanding of the nature of nationalism, of the nature of this movement that, as the historical experience shows, claim, as I said earlier, to represent the whole people and develop policies, politics, aim to nationalize people and creating them the feeling that they are different or better and they deserve a state of their own. And this is very often a way of threatening individual rights in the name of a collectivity, creating, in the meantime, compulsory identities and fostering the belief that there is such things as a particular demos that deserves its own state. So, I don't want to extend myself much. Any claim concerning the so-called right to decide cannot be evaluated in isolation as an abstract democratic request that can be just intellectually discussed, but in the context provided by constitutional democracies that must, as the Constitution aims, to include the protection of individual rights and social pluralism. And much forgotten principle, which is the moral neutrality of the state, by the way. So as long as that context stands, and hence we are not talking about any kind of democracy, but we're talking about a constitutional democracy where the rule of law sets limits to popular government. It's an important idea. Democracy cannot decide just everything. And we're not talking about any kind of society, but about a pluralistic society where there is no overwhelming majority, again, about this succession. There is no such right to self-determination, at least in my view.
Thank you. Montserrat, would you like to go back on this issue of self-determination?
Well, thank you. Well, what I'm doing is just following the instructions that I got from you, so I'm just responding to the questions that you pose. So it's not an impromptu change. It's something I've been working on just to fulfill exactly the questions that you were asking. So this would be then question 2, and question 2 is the independence of Catalonia legitimate? My response is yes. Is it legitimate, the idea that all Spaniards should decide upon a part of Spain? My response is, accepting the principles of freedom and democracy, no Spanish autonomous community has the right to interfere in the governance of any other community, taking into account that Spain is a modern democratic state formed by different peoples endued with their own identity. This is my question 2.
Okay, now going back to I'll follow my own order. Otherwise, it's going to be a bit complicated. Now, the right to self-determination in a representative democracy that respects minorities. Does it make sense?
Well, I don't know. Am I?
To respect minorities makes sense, quite a lot of sense, I think.
Well, I think minorities are being respected in every democratic country, as a matter of fact. The problem is if you don't satisfy the demands of those minorities. And the problem in the end, I think Manuel has said it very clearly, the problem in the end is the logic of nationalism, right? So nationalism implies that if you consider yourself to be a people, you have the right to a state. And I think this principle applies everywhere. It has always been used by nationalist movements. And I think every nationalist movement has a right to try to achieve that end. The problem is if it's legal or not. It's not illegal in the United Kingdom because in the United Kingdom Parliament is sovereign, in order to decide that the Scotch can vote. But the Spanish Parliament, in the case that they would want the Catalans to vote for on secession, is not sovereign to adopt that decision. So that decision would be suppressed by the Constitutional Court. So as you know, in United Kingdom we don't have the Constitutional Court. So British Parliament is, as the French would say, pouvoir constituant and pouvoir constituer at the same time. So it's constituent power, right? So they can decide anything because there are no formal legal restrictions to the will. But that's not the case of Spain. It's not the case of France. It's not the case of Italy. So if tomorrow South Tyrol asks for a referendum of independence within the Spanish state, well, the Italian Constitutional Court would say, no, you don't have that right. So, but I think it's useless to keep on turning around legal issues. I think we should tackle it as a political issue, and we should try to face the problem within a very particular context, which is the context of Europe. Because if you look at it coldly, I would say, so what happens if the Catalans decide to be independent within the European Union, for instance? There would be, in the case that they would have a majority, of course, there would be no borders. All those citizens, Spanish citizens living in Catalonia who would like to keep on being Spanish citizens would have the right to do so. Spanish language would be just as alive as it is nowadays. So why not? So why is it so dramatic? But this same argument can be turned the other way around and say, well, if that's the case, if that's the end state, so why independence? Why not try to remake the constitutional compact? Why not try to give Catalonia a different accommodation within the Spanish state? It would be less dramatic, probably, and the result would be more or less the same. Because as you're living now you're experiencing now in the UK because of the Brexit, the dramatic thing about the Brexit is that we are too interdependent in Europe, right? So even within the countries, that interdependence is even greater. And so imagine if that split happens. So in the end, I think it's a problem of balancing goods and evils, political goods or political evils, and in trying to satisfy what the majority, in this case of the Catalans, would do in fact prefer. Because as far as we know, so the country is split in two. What has happened in Scotland, has happened in Quebec. So it's 50-50. right? So can you solve that situation making half of the population lose? Or is there a way of looking for another agreement where 2/3 would think that they're winning instead of having half of them losing? I think those are the relevant questions. I mean, I think they're very reasonable questions, because we know by the polls that if the question is not are you in favor or not of the independence of Catalonia, if the question is are you in favor of independence first, A, B, the status quo, C, having a larger self-governing capacities, the C option will be clearly majoritarian within Catalonia, right? So why try to press the Catalan people to say yes or no? I mean, so why not try to negotiate a different agreement? I think that's the point that we should discuss. But as I said at the beginning, this goes against the spirit of nationalism. So nationalism is polarizing. So everything presents itself not just on part of Catalan nationalism, also on part of Spanish nationalism. It's either or, right? So you're either Catalan or you're Spanish. So you can't be both things at the same time. So, and for Spanish nationalists, Catalans cannot be anything else than Spanish, right? So, and maybe we should break, this, I think this incredibly dramatic presentation of political conflict. I think we should try to come to a more consensual situation.
Montserrat.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to question 3, and my question 3 is, are referendums a good mechanism to sort out problems? The response that I suggest is yes. Referendums are not only a good way to sort out problems, they stand as the main and only road to be followed by those in government who are concerned about finding out the views and needs of their citizens. Referendums should offer the main route to be followed by governments so that the clear views of citizens could be taken into account.
Right. Manuel, would you like to?
Which answer is the one I have to?
We're actually, we don't have the same questions.
Well, I can only say.
I noticed that.
Yeah,
we can link your question with the referendum.
I think
this one.
With the one I'm going to ask you, which is very simple.
But, excuse me.
Yes.
For me, it's very important to say that I was given a remit to respond some questions written. And I had these questions from you. I had the questions written from Javier.
The two versions of
Just
question to everyone, but it was kind of framework.
yes, but I took them seriously.
I can manage.
Okay, you can do it.
Okay, never mind.
Okay, I took them seriously,
Never mind.
and they are
Okay. We link
exactly
the issue of
that.
referendum that you've rightly raised with the one which is
I can take the reference.
the idea referendum linked to the idea of is the idea that some Spaniards decide about the future of Spain legitimate?
Yeah.
Up to what point can this legitimacy be applied? Do you apply it to the autonomous communities in general? Do you apply it to the Catalan case in particular? Do you apply it to the provinces as well? So where does this lead and where does this stop?
Okay. Yeah, I can take both questions. Well, let me start by saying that insofar as Spain is not a militant democracy, and hence it does not restrict prima facie the kind of ideas that can be defended and promoted by individuals, as long as they are defended by democratic means, legal and democratic means, which is an important proviso, of course, there is no way that we can claim that defending Catalonia's independence is not legitimate. However, I wonder where it makes so much sense, as it seems, to upload political mobilization that demands a right that does not exist, and that in fact threatens to break up the democratic constitutional order. I think there's an incongruity there, but of course we have to accept the legitimacy of this claim. About the referendum and about the idea that the rest of Spain should decide about whether Catalonia can go or not in such a referendum were granted. I think that the issue with referendums in this context is very tricky, because if you don't need a referendum because there is an overwhelming majority, well, then it's okay. 80% of the people want to go, in the case like Czechoslovakia, for instance, so, well, farewell, it's fine. And when you do need a referendum because it's very, fractured communities, then a referendum is a bad idea. So I think this is an irony that takes place here. Let me begin, however, by saying that if such an overwhelming majority in Catalonia would exist, and it doesn't, and I think it will never exist, I don't think that the rest of Spain could prevent them from leaving. I think this is a bit absurd, It's like, forcing your partner to stay after the divorce has been, agreed upon. And this is not on my part an incongruity. I mean, I can at the same time deny the existence of this right to self-determination, but at the same time invoke some sort of, political realism, or a factual proviso to recognize or to acknowledge that when 70–80% of the people in a given community want to leave another community, this eventually will of course happen, and there is no reason to stop it. But we are discussing here a hard case, and hard cases are the tricky ones. And we're talking about fractured communities where no such majority exists. And in this case, I think that I disagree with Montserrat. I'm not so sure about referendums. I mean, I think it takes some courage to defend referendums after Brexit in this country. I'm not so sure about them being so good ideas. Because, and I think Fernando has said something about that earlier on, they are divisive, they are polarizing, and in fractured communities, they will eventually leave one of the two parts of the corresponding electorate much frustrated about the result. Before that, they will create false expectations. I think Richard knows a bit about this. Inflame the perilous emotions of belonging, creating this logic of us versus them, split families and communities, and exacerbate tensions within the whole country. At the same time, if we generally state the acceptability of referendums to self-determination, we are creating, as I said earlier, an incentive to nationalistic movements everywhere to go on with their demands, their self-victimization, and their nationalizing policies, educating people in the belief that they need a referendum. On the other hand, and although I respect very much the reasoning behind the Equality Act in Canada and the decision of the Supreme Court in Canada, I think there is also a bit of unrealism there. It's a bit self-delusional, because on the one hand, referendums, and Brexit is again a good example, when they are debated, they don't precisely follow the highest standards of deliberation in democracies. Lies abound, and the emotional advantage that utopian formulations possess against the continuation of an existing state of things cannot be avoided. And at the same time, and I finish with this, no matter how many negotiating rules are pre-established, for instance, saying, okay, you have to attend to what indigenous people say, to what the provinces say, and there is the need for a special majority. It cannot be like one more vote, as Fernando said, which, to my surprise, was the case in the Scotland referendum. So you need 2/3 of the electorate, etc. That is very fine. And I think that those are very good guiding principles. But if the next day after a referendum, independence has won by just one vote, you are creating a political dynamic that I think that makes very difficult to respect those guarantees.
Montserrat, do you want to go back on this issue of referendums then?
Where
do you apply them?
Yes.
How far do you reach with them?
Yes, indeed. I think that now I'll start with, with, it follows quite well from the remit that you gave me.
Great.
Yeah? So, from a normative perspective, what is the best solution for political nations endowed with more than one cultural nation? That was question 4. And my response is, from a normative perspective, the best solution should be to create a plurinational democracy, taking the models of Quebec and Scotland as examples, thus vindicating the right of citizens to decide upon their political future by means of negotiating with the state and, if necessary, calling upon international mediators. That's my response to the question.
Right. So, what must be done then when political differences are so deep within a territory? What kind of solutions are preferable or ideal? Fernando.
I don't know. Well, I can try to speculate. I don't have a real answer because every situation is a story in itself. And so if we compare the situation in the Basque Country vis-a-vis Spanish state, or what happens in Belgium, even in the United Kingdom, they all have enormous differences. They have things in common, but they have enormous differences. So I don't think there is a way, an only way to handle the problems of multinationalism, or countries that have multilingual situations, that have different feelings of belonging. Because in a way, in every complex society, I think it's very tricky to say that the country itself, the state, is not sufficiently welcoming, to differences, to national differences. But the autonomous community in question is also not welcoming to differences regarding those people that don't share the nationalist feeling. And I think that's what makes this a problem. If 65% of the Catalans will be in favor of independence, that's it. The only thing that we have to do is to negotiate how to split. But precisely because that's not the case, it's because it's so complicated. And I think that's also the case of Scotland, as we saw. It's also the case of Quebec, as we saw. And then I'd like to return to the question of the referendum. So once you make a referendum, it's forever, or it's can you decide again and again until you have a majority? And if you have a majority at last for independence, then okay, it's over. So we saw it in Quebec, and I think that's why the Supreme Court in Canada reacted the way it did. So when it stated, that there should be a clear majority, in favor of that move, but it also stated, and I think the Spanish Supreme Court also transmitted the same message. This is a political situation, so don't push us, to try to solve through legal means what really should be solved through political negotiations. And so you were right once at the beginning when you said so that this problem started being such because the Spanish state didn't move, in order to try to negotiate after the revision of the Statute of Autonomy in the Catalan situation. And if you allow me just a couple of minutes, I think the sad thing about the Catalan story is that Spain, that didn't have the federalist tradition at all, organized a quite decentralized system in order to avoid precisely what we are witnessing, which is the fact that as you say, this system of devolution was thought mainly for those what we call the historical regions, Basque Country, Catalonia, and Galicia. Mm-hmm. But it spread out, to the rest, simply because at that time, during the transition, so the governors were really afraid of the military, and so they wanted to make it not too ostentatiously. And but in the end, in the end, the result is that we failed, and that's why I want to go back to the idea that I initially stated, that what we need is a new agreement, a new territorial agreement, and I think that's which cannot be but a federal agreement. So federalize the statute of autonomies, in the sense that we need another concept as well of the state, of the federation, more welcoming to multilingualism, because that's what the Canadian did very well.
Yes.
So there's just one state that speaks French in Canada, but French is co-official, it's a language, all over the country. So that doesn't happen in Spain, and it doesn't happen in Switzerland, for instance. And I think we should really try to remake it. And that's why we need a change of the constitution more, in order to be capable of incorporating a different idea of the federation, so that countries such as Catalonia and also the Basque country, don't feel that the Spanish state is something alien to them, that they also are part of that state, because that state recognizes the language, just the same as it recognizes, for instance, the Spanish language itself. So I think there are means to solve it without trying to split more, not just Catalonia, but Spain itself.
Spain.
Okay.
Psycho?
Montserrat.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was willing to say something about this very subject, about the normative solution that you were starting to talk about. I agree with most of what Fernando has said, but not with all. Let's be aware of the word solution to begin with. Solutions in these subjects are always partial, temporary. We're talking about politics, so let's not hope so much from, let's not expect so much from any so-called solution in this realm. To me, the solution is very simple. It lies in symbolic recognition and evolution of powers. That's the traditional way of handling these problems of subnational demands within a state. And the question I would like to pose is, what happens when the solution has already been implemented? And to me, this is the case of Spain. If you take the Constitution of 1978, as the late Juan Linz already recognized, it's a very quasi-federal constitution that grants a lot of autonomy to Catalonia and other regions, nations, if you will, in Spain. So, of course, be it in the guise of a federal state or in the case of the autonomous state in Spain, this is the solution. Of course, you cannot do this in a way that undermines the fiscal and symbolic foundations of the federal state itself. It's important to recognize this as well. A proper balance must be found, and you have to have what the Germans call Bundestreue, or federal solidarity.
Loyalty.
Loyalty, exactly, sorry. And again, the problem to me lies in the nature of nationalism. If you have already autonomy, you have self-government, you have the tools to promote your own language and culture, just enjoy it. It's there, you have it. But what about the logic of nationalism, which is always demanding more, and is always claiming that it lacks, in this case, as of late, statehood? Of course, I think that in this respect, democracy is about a fair degree of inclusion, recognition, devolution, but it's also about a reasonable degree of frustration on the part of everyone. Spain has also a certain amount of people who would like to have a centralism, and suppress the autonomies. And, they're not so silent anymore. I don't think that they're right in their demands, but they are frustrated in their demands. So everyone has to be a bit frustrated in these kind of situations, to my mind. And I'm not at all against a deepening of the federal state, and I think that what Fernando has just said makes a lot of sense. But the perceptions about misrecognitions or lack of resources, or lack of symbolic recognition, I would say, is the most important thing here, are also created by nationalistic elites. And in the case of Spain, I think we have to also take into account the fact that inverse federalism is more complicated than a federalism that is, the beginning of a new state, because some other particular units, different units have been assembled. And I think we are suffering a bit of that, because the logic in an inverse federalism is to give more and more power to the periphery, whereas in a different federalism, like the United States, for instance, the logic is the central state having more and more power. So I think this makes the Spanish case more tricky, but of course I will go for a deepening of the federal state insofar as, nationalism units within it are loyal to this project.
Thank you very much. Okay, Montserrat.
Thank you very much. Question 5 is, what should be done when political preferences in a country vary according to the different territories? What are the preferred solutions? I think that this question actually matches very much or works quite well, or at least opens up a possibility to do something with this, to work with this, no? So what should be done when political preferences in a country vary according to the different territories? What are the preferred solutions? My response is that what should be done is to negotiate and avoid conflict by turning diversity into an asset, with the aim to foster mechanisms to promote plurinational democracy. And there are many ways to do that, and many successful ways to do that. And it depends very much on who is the leader at the time, and the sensitivity and sensibility of the person, and the connection with the people that are listening and hearing and following this. So to negotiate is very, very important, and avoid conflict by turning diversity into an asset, as I was saying a moment ago, with the aim to foster mechanisms to promote plurinational democracy. Plurinational democracy has worked in a number of cases, has been tested, and it's been positive, at least in the case of Quebec, at least in the case of other specific situations, other cases. But the most important thing that connects with this is that one has to negotiate, among other things, to avoid corruption, to improve social services, to grant priority to health and education, and foster a sense of community. First of all, it is necessary to promote a collective project able to engage the citizenry and respect existing diversity. Trust among citizens should be restored and fostered, even if people don't like each other, don't like the things they want to do, don't like the way they live. But we need to make this effort if we care about the future of our country, and also about our future as citizens, regardless of where we are. This is the key in here, and I only need to give the final question, but I think I should wait, or can I do it?
What is the final question?
The final question is... All right, well, this is a positive thing, because the fact that you are at least laughing a little bit breaks down the tension, right? Which is important.
All very relaxed.
So, question 6 is the following. What would be, this is a question, is what would be a sufficient majority so that eventually independence could be agreed and accepted? Why this level of support and not other? And my response is the following. 51% would be enough according to Spanish legal norms. However, in my view, and with the intention to avoid breaking up social cohesion in Catalonia, in my view, it would be sufficient to have a majority of 65%. And that would be something that we could all work with also a good deal of goodwill, because goodwill plays a key part in this process.
Thank you. To finish off with this point, what would be theoretically a sufficiently big majority to accept a referendum?
Well, I said the same numbers, 65%, I said it before, but I hope that we don't need to count those votes. No, I want to tackle another issue, which I think it's maybe the most important one. I think we can design here perfect federal institutions or whatever, but we have to look at the actual political actors. And I think what we're experiencing, both in Catalonia and in Spain, is an absolute lack of leadership. I think there are no incentives on part of either side to try to push for an agreement. On the Spanish side, because you have much better electoral results if you're tough against Catalonia, and this explains that in the polls, most of the both Ciudadanos and the Partido Popular are, not the Partido Popular, but mainly Ciudadanos is growing, and the left is being left out, of this problem, because the left has always problems with identity politics. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So class identity has disappeared, and they don't know how to solve, the problem of national identities or other kinds of identities. And on part, on the Catalan side, they've already, as we say in Spain, gone up to the mountains. They have already radicalized themselves. So it's very difficult to imagine that after having pushed an enormous amount of Catalans, towards independence, that he would have to tell them, no. So we were wrong. So let's stop. Let's negotiate, and then we'll see if we can achieve something better, in the future. And I think without those incentives, no matter what we design here tonight, in terms of integration, I think there's no solution. At least in the short run, for the problem. And I think it would be very important, extremely important, that we as members of civil societies, as I said before, try to push them, in order to sit down and try to negotiate, because I think it's the most important problem that we have since the democratic transition.
Manuel.
I would like to go back to question 5 in the remit.
Well, I'd rather you answer the question about referendums. We have no time.
But I think it has been misunderstood. I think it's a very interesting question.
Very quickly.
I think that originally intended to ask about what happens when, like in Scotland, for instance, you have, let's say the case of Scotland. There is this complaint that they have a social democrat leaning, and then in Westminster you have the Tories governing all the time. So I think the question was referring to this reality, that policies are, separate and different for a long time. And I think it's an interesting question, because it poses another one, which I think was mentioned by Fernando earlier, and I would like to recover, but I will be quick. To begin with, I think it is difficult to imagine a situation when this happens all the time, but maybe the Scottish case could give us a hint that this is eventually possible. And in principle, this would be a case of what you were referring earlier, of minorities systematically ignored or overlooked in the political process. And you were taking that as Catalonian nationalists being ignored by the Spanish government,
Yes.
which is in principle fair enough. But on the one hand, I think that this discrepancy, the fact that policies are systematically pursued in a region that differ from the one pursued by the central government, it's not enough to grant self-determination right to begin with. I think this can hardly be labeled as oppression. If you have enough self-government and enough powers to implement your own policies, this shouldn't be such a big problem. If you don't have them, of course, then I understand that this will be an issue. But what is interesting to me in this question is the fact that you always have, or you can have, most of the time, overlooked or systematically ignored minorities within your own territory. You have people who doesn't share nationalistic feelings in Catalonia, and you have people who are not social democrats in Scotland. So the question to me is, are we going to be worried about this question just when nationalism is complaining, or are we going to take minorities seriously all the time? I think this is something that is important to underline. And again, about referendum, I would go up to 2/3 of the electorate. We said a bit more than 60%. Although of course I wouldn't run a referendum. But I think it's important also to end with this. What Fernando has said earlier. I mean, in the Brexit we have this example of the feelings were a little bit unstable, and people say, well, maybe we made a mistake. But promoters of Brexit say we're not going to ask again. So this is a very important issue. So you need this reinforced majority, to my mind.
Thank you very much. We can now open the floor and take some questions from the audience. Please identify yourself and try and keep them short and straight to the point. Yes.
I have a question for Manuel.
Yes. Go ahead.
So I think if I understood correctly, the divisiveness within Catalonia is supposed to count against their ability to self-determine. So I'm wondering what the moral justification is for restricting the community's right to self-determination when the divisiveness of any sovereign country would never justify an infringement on their autonomy. So the divisiveness in the United States right now, which is incredibly divided, would never justify an infringement on American sovereignty. Yet you seem to suggest that because some Catalonians don't want to separate, that justifies Spain's ability to not recognize the legitimacy of a referendum.
Yes,
thank you.
That's a short answer. More than half Catalonians reject independence. I think this is the starting point of the discussion. A little bit more than half of the... I mean, this is what the polls say.
If you have a referendum, you'll find out.
We have already exposed the reasons why referendums are not a solution in fractured communities, to my view at least.
Quiet, please.
If I may answer.
Quiet.
I don't think that the unity, so to speak, of the United States is at stake now because of the divisiveness of the country. But I think that precisely this deep divisiveness that is already fostered by nationalistic logics recommend not granting this right. Of course, that's my view.
Thank you.
Yeah, we are going to take 3 questions.
Yes. Go ahead.
So my question is going back to the first question, the right of self-determination. I was a bit confused because at the beginning I thought you mentioned that you don't think that there is a right of self-determination for Catalonia because it's not a colony and it's not there is no injustice like in Kosovo. But I think that later we heard that if 80% of the people would vote for independence, then it would be a fact. So are we saying that actually there is a right of self-determination and it depends on the percentage of the people who wants to be independent?
Thank you.
We are going to wait.
You referred to Fernando.
Let's take 3 questions.
Right. Okay.
Yes, good evening. My question is basically for Professor Vallespín and Professor Manuel. It's about your comments on basically here the problem is nationalism being a force that basically divides society and polarizes it, I think we're missing the point of what politics exactly is about. Politics is about conflict, be it class conflicts, gender conflicts, ethnicity conflicts, or national conflicts. Nationalisms, in one part or another, just take part of one side or another. Of course, there's a multiplicity of nationalisms. There can be ethnic nationalism or more cosmopolitan nationalism, such as, I believe, the Catalanese, the Basques, the Galicianese, or the Scottishes. So I think that view on nationalism is, I would say, biased, but at least. That's my first point. The second point is a reaction about what Manuel has said about, okay, you have autonomy, use it, get over it. That's a pill that is hard to swallow, especially in the last few years in Catalonia, or as in my case coming from Galicia, which has seen, of course, the language completely on the verge of disappearance. And finally, I have to react as well. Yeah, just finishing. Taking the state of Spain as the last 40 years of democracy is a very narrow idea of what the Spanish state is. These peoples have coexisted together for many, many years, and not strictly just under these 40 years of democracy, also under Franco, under the Republic, under the various monarchies. So yes, that's my question and reflection for that.
One more, one more, and then.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the debate so far. So my question is again also for Fernando and Manuel, but it's like, how would you reply to this counter-argument to your argument against referendums? So you say you shouldn't have a referendum, you should negotiate. And they are already negotiating, you know. But negotiation is not a nice place where people just shake hands and look for an agreement. It's a conflict of powers. They are negotiating. They just if you want to negotiate, you will put yourself in the strongest position. You will foster conflict sometimes in order to negotiate. You're negotiating in a 6 months span. You're negotiating in a 20-year, 40-year span. So within negotiating, there's an incentive also for conflict. So not having a referendum precisely puts an end to this incentive for conflict. It gives a frame for a solution.
Thank you. Fernando, you want to start?
All very good questions, I think, and difficult to answer. That's why this good. Okay, I want to repeat some of my arguments. First, the guy over there. What I said, and I think I made myself quite clear, is that if you take international, if you take, don't worry, have a bit of background music. If you take international legality, so there's no such thing as the right to self-determination on part of European regions, I would say, right? Because we don't live under colonial situations. But this is not just a legal problem. I mean, this is a political problem. And that was my main issue, right? So you have to solve problems as they come. But, it's not just a problem for, both Manuel and I underlined that point a few times. It's not just a problem for the Spanish state. It's also a problem for Catalonia, right? Because, they present themselves as a whole, but they're fractured. Just as the Spanish state is fractured, right? So that's why it's so difficult to solve. That was my point from the beginning. But in the end, so you have to change the law. In that case, you have to change the statute of autonomy. You even have to change the Spanish constitution in order to allow the Catalan people to decide sooner or later. And I think that's it's going to come. I mean, they do decide. They decided just a couple of months ago. They do decide in every election. And that's a way of saying, look, those are the people that we vote. We vote for those parties because we want independence. We vote for those other parties because we don't want independence. And we know the result. And the result is 50-50. That's it. So there's not much that you can do. You can force a referendum on such a drastically split society, and that has a lot to do with what you said, right? Because so, why does Spain or the Spanish government has to negotiate with Catalonia, and why doesn't the Catalan government have to negotiate with its opposition? It's the same thing, right? So why just one way and not the other way? Because in Catalonia they have the same problem within as we have with Catalonia within the Spanish state. So it's, it's this rhetoric of a people that's being pushed down. What people? I mean, define the people, count the votes, and then you have a different result. And because if it were really a people that you can objectively touch, then we would have a problem, right? But we have a different kind of problem, which is that you have to negotiate both in Catalonia and in the central state. And I think that's what makes this pretty difficult. And then regarding the Galician guy, well, look, I underline the question of nationalism, because I think, of course, politics is conflict. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's about antagonisms, it's about conflict, but there are two kinds of conflicts. I don't know who said it. There are divisible conflicts and indivisible conflicts. Divisible conflicts are conflicts which have to do with more or less of something. So economic or class conflicts are a typical example. But indivisible conflicts are very difficult to solve because they're mainly based on identities. And so it's very difficult to negotiate with identities, because there's no way that you can objectify an identity or that you can live one part of that identity, apart, because, it's necessary for your negotiation, in the sense that, but if you look at Galicia, and I know a lot about Poles because I've studied that a lot regarding identities, 63% of the Galicians think themselves as both Galicians and Spanish. 63%, not counting those that only think of themselves as being Galician. And in the case of Catalonia, I mean, it's just 25% who think of themselves just as Catalans. So if we look at identities, then we see that the majority are mixed identities. Even in the lesser ones are in the Basque country, but in Catalonia and in Galicia, most of them are mixed identities. But I think, I said it before, I think we should be practical, and we should go, and I think you defined it perfectly well. This is a political conflict, and we should analyze it as such, and not, stop in the details regarding, what system can we implement in Spain in order to solve it. The first thing is to be capable of getting those people, the political actors, sitting together and trying to initiate negotiations. I mean, it has to be done. I mean, they can start even extremely quickly, because I think we have an enormous problem regarding, the fact that you mentioned at the beginning, there are some of the leaders they are in jail. And so, this situation cannot go on for long.
Thank you. Running out of time, so please be brief.
Okay, yeah. Thanks very much for the questions. I will try to clarify some of my controversial statements. I don't think there is an incongruity in saying that there is no such thing as a right to self-determination, but acknowledging that when in a given community you have 70-80% of the people wanting to succeed, this is a situation that you cannot ignore. And it is not incongruous, because if you grant the right, you are undermining the very foundations of the international order. We have to remind ourselves that Europe was built against nationalism. I think we are forgetting very easily cruel lessons of history in this respect. And we have now more than 200 years of experience in democratic societies. And this also, I think, helps us to respond to the very interesting question about politics being about conflict. Of course it is. But it is also about channeling conflict in reasonable ways. And it is also about creating social stable orders. And the logic of nationalism and what has brought to Europe in the 21st century should not be forgotten when we are discussing these issues. And that's why we have a body of legal norms that restrict very much the right to self-determination in the international context. And finally, when I was saying just enjoy it, just get over it, I mean, this was in a very particular context. I was saying that if you claim, rightly to my view, that the solution to the problems posed by demands on the part of subnational communities lies in the evolution of powers and symbolic recognition, which may be very aptly embodied in the idea of the federal state, and you have already implemented this solution. I think that the Spanish Constitution of 1978 is very much like plurinational, it's very like a federal state. Then what? Then I'm talking about a region where there is no such thing as an overwhelming majority in favor of independence, and that has all the instruments and tools to pursue its own cultural identity, to foster its language, to have their own, social and economic policies, etc. So I think that's fine. If you cannot have independence because there is no majority. That was the context in which I said just enjoy it, which is maybe too provocative a statement. Thank you.
Briefly?
Montserrat, yes.
Thank you very much. It's important what we've been talking about here, but my question is the following. Are we aware of what has happened in Catalonia? You could be for, against, neutral, whatever. But there are only two things I like to say. The first one is that Catalonia has been damaged, seriously damaged, because not everybody thinks the same. Catalonia is diverse. There are people who are very diverse, right? But now, in Catalonia, the trust that existed is gone. And this means that anything you do is going to be more difficult to be achieved. Simply because there is this lack of trust that now is a very important element in here. If we look at this as an example in political theory, we have one interpretation, one academy to follow. If we look at the life of peoples and the consequences, personal consequences for those who are in this difficult situation, I'm talking about people that we know that some Catalans are still in prison, for example. We had not been mentioned here before, but this is a fact, right? And it's just very, very difficult to restore trust, and it's going to be difficult. So if we want to move forward, we really need to work together and have a common project. The common project that we need is something that should help us to work united and push forward. And in this process, it doesn't mean that everything that we think personally is going to be taken into account, specifically like that. It won't be possible. We all have to renounce something to try to restore society and also restore the future for other generations, because the situation, like it or not, is there and it's very difficult, and it requires mediation and it requires all the help that you can give it, because otherwise is going to be a mess and something very difficult to deal with for a long time. So we all have to renounce something to achieve something.
Thank you. We have time for just a final...
No, we have like 10 minutes.
Okay, let's have a final round of questions. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the debate. I wanted to ask the panel a brief question. Professor Vallespín argued that some reforms would be needed, maybe the Constitution, I don't know, but I think that there's no political will for majorities to push these reforms forward, at least nowadays. And you've pointed to several aspects of why this is the case, like Professor Arias mentioned that a fair part of the Spanish society wants a more centralized state, and there are other aspects. So I wanted to ask if you think it would make sense to ask for mediation from the European Union, or if this is out of the question. Thank you.
I would like to ask, when you're talking about negotiating, how is it possible to negotiate something when the government is putting politicians in prison, and when you have politicians that they are not even in the country, because if they come back, they're going to be in prison? And if we're talking about internal law, I would like to know why the law is not the same for everyone. Why a politician that is talking about independence or for the political idea is going to prison, but all the people that are, I don't know, stealing money, corruption, so many things that happen in Spain, nothing is happening. And finally, why is it illegal to vote, but is legal to beat people up just because to vote? So I think that's not being mentioned. So where is your legality?
Thank you. One more. Yeah. Go with that.
Hi. First, two reactions to Mr. Manuel, Arias and Fernando. The first is, if Spain has not been colonized, if Spain has not colonized Catalonia, I feel like today we're certainly being colonized by the so-called intelligentsia. I think you need to come down to the ivory tower, you need to come to Catalonia to see what's happening. Really, it's mandatory. We can't carry on like this. If people are in prison, if politicians are not able to do their job, what kind of negotiation are we having here?
Make a question, please.
Yeah.
So that's a question.
Now, knows very well Artur Mas, who tried to do that kind of negotiation, not even for a federal state, just asking for that kind of sort of devolution with some aspect of financial. So finally, I would like to ask Professor Montserrat, what is this thing that we keep on talking about, this kind of, it's not federal state you mentioned earlier, you mentioned plurinational democracy. How does that work out if all the things that we have so far have just failed because there's no one on the other side? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry. Sorry, I got carried away.
Okay, let's take one more. Yes. Yeah. Okay. We finish off with this one. Yeah. Over the gentleman at the back. Yes.
This is the last question.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Question to Mr. Fernando. The principle of territorial integrity and self-determination. How can these two concepts be reconciled, especially in the European context? You said that you can't self-determination in Europe, but Kosovo, separated. ICJ in 2010 said that the unilateral declaration of independence wasn't contrary to international law. So how do you maintain and how can you reconcile these two
customary and international law principles, because it's going to affect other parts of the world, Africa and South America. Santa Cruz in Bolivia wants to separate, supposedly in Venezuela, and Zulia region state may want to separate. So how can you reconcile these two separate principles of customary international law?
Thank you very much. Fernando, you want to begin?
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know, it's not the government that puts people in jail, it's the judiciary. The judiciary acts whenever someone breaks the law. That's what the Catalan government did. I'm sorry, in any state, any democratic state, you ought to apply the law. And it doesn't depend on the government, it depends on the judiciary, which is, the institutions that have to do what they did. I'm against having this cautionary prison for those people, as you can imagine. I'm absolutely against it. But, it's a judicial decision. It's not a decision made by our president of government, nor by any particular minister. So in that sense, what you have to ask yourself is, how can we react the way we react when we, when we allow our government, in this case the Catalan government, to make a step, the way they did. I mean, they did unilaterally secede Catalonia from Spain. They broke down the legality within Catalonia. I mean, well, it's a fact. And so we should have stayed, any government would have reacted against it, because every government ought to apply the law. And as I said at the beginning, so if you want to decide about independence, everything, okay, let's change the constitution. But it would have happened exactly the same in France, in Switzerland, anywhere. I mean, it's in Germany. I mean, that's what happens if you break the law. So I think we should be capable of differentiating the different steps. Another thing is that someone said, before. Another thing is, so what can we do if people in Madrid don't react year after year? And then I have to recognize, so something ought to be done, but not breaking the law. I mean, there are ways, to achieve those political ends different than breaking the law. I think it's keep on demonstrating, keep on moving, keep on trying to negotiate with parties different than the governmental party and things like that. So in that sense, I think that's a key point, really. But suddenly, and I said it at the beginning, the Canadian Supreme Court was absolutely clear on this point. There is no right for unilaterally secede from a country, not international, not by international law, not by Canadian law. And it's not, look at the reaction, of the rest of Europe. They say, so Spain is applying its law. We may not like it, but you have to apply your law. Maybe we should change it, of course. And then, regarding your case, as I said also at the beginning, in Kosovo there was a genocide being practiced, right? So the problem is how do you split democratic countries that have regions that have such an enormous capacity for self-government. I think that's the question is, and I tried to give an answer, and I tried to give an answer in the sense that I don't think the case of Spain now is a problem of giving Catalonia more competences, because they practically have all of them, or to the Basque country. I think the problem for Spain is changing the federation, changing the nature of the state, right? So that, it's not so Spanish, let's say, it's more
plurinational.
Yeah, and it's actually plurilingual. And, these symbolic elements of recognition are lacking in our federation. And I think that's where we have to put our finger, and try to try to direct it, you know, and try to change exactly that point. And I think Canada, in that sense, is a good example, you know, and because Switzerland is more complicated. Switzerland, you know, it's more, you know, the languages are somehow more divided. But I think the Canadian case in that respect is very important, because in the end, I think this is a problem of Russian national recognition. It's not a problem of not having enough resources for self-government, because they do have. I mean, the Catalans have resources for self-government, right? So it's, and this is the problem with nationalism. Again, you know, with my Galician friend before. The problem with nationalism, recognition is the key, right? Mm-hmm. But it's difficult to pinpoint, you know, exactly how far it goes, because if there's no recognition except building your own state, then we have a problem. But not just in Spain, everywhere. See. And I think Manuel said it at the beginning. I mean, so if there should be a state for any people or for any group that consider itself to be people, then we will triple, or there will be 500 more, 500 states, you know, at least, you know, in the world, and of course in Europe.
Thank you.
Which order?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. So try to be brief. There's a paradox here. Sorry. Okay. There's a paradox here at play, I think. You were referring to the damage caused by the so-called process. I can hardly agree more with you. Of course, there's a great damage, and the consequences of this unilateral rupture of the country, the attempt to unilaterally succeed of Catalonia, are not still seen. I mean, we have more to see in the coming months, I think, I'm afraid. And I think that there is a paradox, because the very absolution that Fernando was referring to is now more difficult than ever, because the process has made it more difficult, stirring up different feelings in the rest of Spain. And that's why Ciudadanos, as Fernando was saying, is going up in the polls. And that's why the very left, PSOE especially, is so split about this subject. So the process has made things more difficult for nationalism. And now the first goal for nationalism is to recover autonomy, not to having a nation. And in this respect, I think it's very frivolous to say that people are in jail because of their opinions. This is not true. May I talk, please? We have the rule of law in Spain, in Europe. Probably there has never been crimes more anticipated in the history of criminal law, because we're reading about that in the picture in the newspapers every day. If you do this, you will have to apply this article of the criminal law, etc. It was clear to everyone because it's written in the law. And of course, there are some, investigations underway in the judiciary which points to the colonizing of institutions on the part of nationalism. You have misuse of public money, you have the use of private data of citizens, and you have the whole organization of the referendum. So it's not just a matter of opinion. That's very frivolous to say. And finally, you were saying that we should go to Catalonia and see what happens there. We don't have a clue about what's going on. I think that there are other things happening in Catalonia as well. For instance, if I'm not mistaken, the elections have been won by an anti-nationalistic party. Ciudadanos. Is it true? No? The most voted party was not Ciudadanos? Okay, then we have a post-truth question here. And the thing is that Catalonia does not belong to nationalism. You cannot say, we the Catalans want to succeed. There is a fractured community. And if we don't recognize this fact, going on, negotiating and agreeing upon a solution about this subject, it's simply impossible. Thank you.
Thank you. Montserrat, you can finish off.
It's interesting that at the end of the session we begin to see some of the problems, some of the challenges, some of the differences. Maybe we should stay on a bit longer or just do it again in another venue, as they do it sometimes. So people reflect now, and then you think about this, and in the process, maybe you get to know the people, and at the end of the day, you can even have a coffee with them. Coffee is very important, because in some circumstances, it can help to ease the situation. And anything that means making the effort, engaging, and being really genuine about democracy is going to have my support all the time, coming from wherever it's possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Vallespín, Maldonado, Guibernau, for this fascinating debate. And I would also like to thank especially the organizers of the Spanish Society for this wonderful contribution to LSE that they've made with this very interesting program. Thank you very much.